Did Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez just get outplayed by Senator John Kennedy's simple country lawyer routine? Let us step inside the most intense political showdown of the year, where a highly publicized debate over student loan forgiveness turned into an absolute masterclass in political maneuvering and consequence. Please assist me in understanding the fundamental mathematics of this specific situation. Congresswoman Senator John Kennedy articulated, speaking in an entirely unhurried, methodical manner that strongly suggested he possessed all the time in the world. I am, at the end of the day, merely a simple rural attorney, and I have been sitting here staring directly at these economic reports for the entirety of the morning. On one side of the ledger, you are passionately demanding the complete and total forgiveness of billions of dollars in student loans, claiming it is a monumental victory for the working class. And yet, I happen to have a demographic breakdown right here, situated directly next to your grand proposal, indicating that the vast majority of this massive debt belongs to the highest earning individuals in our nation. I simply cannot, for the life of me, determine how transferring the financial burdens of future corporate executives onto the exhausted shoulders of everyday laborers represents the authentic you. He proceeded to hold up the printed Federal Reserve report to the room as he spoke, displaying it to the audience exactly as though it were a crucial, undeniable piece of forensic evidence in a murder trial. It was a basic, inexpensive stack of standard printer paper, appearing slightly creased and wrinkled as a result of being folded up and tucked away inside his worn leather briefcase for days. Across the top page, there were distinct, sharply defined statistical graphs printed so clearly that the entire audience, even those seated in the absolute furthest cheap seats in the back of the room, could understand the heavy implications. He rotated the document slowly in his grasp, turning it over deliberately in the exact manner a master craftsman inspects a complex tool he has never encountered before. After this silent inspection, he laid the report completely flat upon the committee table, meticulously smoothing out the paper using just 2 stiff fingers. Sitting directly across the massive wooden table from him, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez observed his every deliberate movement, and for the absolute first time during that entire morning's proceedings, she found herself momentarily pausing to calculate her next move, completely without a rapid-fire comeback. To fully comprehend how a prominent political figure who had essentially built her entire brand identity upon fighting relentlessly for the working class managed to find her own narrative entirely turned against her, one must rewind the clock. You have to travel back approximately 2 minutes in time, back to the specific moment when she still genuinely believed that the rural attorney was incapable of performing basic macroeconomic analysis. The congressional hearing room that particular morning was one of the more cramped, claustrophobic varieties found on the Capitol grounds. It featured a noticeably low ceiling, and the sterile, flat white fluorescent lights hummed steadily over a large committee table, a heavy piece of mahogany furniture that had silently witnessed 4 decades of politicians attempting to explain away their questionable policy decisions. The officially scheduled topic of the hearing revolved around the economic impact of mass student loan forgiveness. Typically, this is precisely the sort of dense, bureaucratic, yet necessary subject matter that completely empties a hearing room rather than filling it to capacity. However, on this specific day, the room was absolutely packed to the brim. The media presence was overwhelming, with television cameras stacked 3 rows deep along the entire back wall, their small red recording indicator lights glowing steadily like watchful eyes. Word had rapidly circulated throughout Washington that Senator Kennedy had specifically requested to be seated on this cross panel, and more importantly, that he had explicitly requested her presence by name. Furthermore, located somewhere in the 4th row of the audience seating, wearing an old, heavy canvas work jacket stained with faint, permanent traces of industrial grease, sat a middle-aged civilian man hailing from a small suburban town in Louisiana. This unassuming man had at one point in his life taken out a modest commercial bank loan at a punishing interest rate to purchase a used plumbing service truck and heavy tools, working grueling 12-hour shifts to pay back every single cent entirely on his own. At this exact moment, absolutely nobody in that crowded room knew who he was, and nobody would recognize his profound significance until the exact moment it mattered the most. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez made her entrance in the exact same manner she always made her entrances, projecting an intense aura that suggested the entire room should consider itself incredibly fortunate just to have her in attendance. She placed her heavy document folder down onto the desk with an audible soft slap that echoed briefly in the quiet chamber. She then meticulously tilted the gooseneck microphone toward her face by a very careful, calculated inch. Following that, she deliberately poured bottled water into a clear glass and positioned that glass exactly where she desired it on the tabletop, ensuring the aesthetic was perfect. She performed every single one of these mundane actions incredibly slowly, behaving exactly the way an individual does when they desperately want an entire room of spectators to notice how completely not nervous they are. Subsequently, she gazed out at the sea of faces in the audience and concluded, in the exact manner she consistently concluded, that she fundamentally understood the financial struggles of every single person in that country vastly better than they understood their own selves. When the committee chairman formally yielded the floor to her, she seized the opportunity much like a person taking the final, victorious word in a lengthy argument she believed she had been winning for years. Before we officially commenced, she declared with absolute authority, "I want to explicitly name what this situation truly is. This is a room absolutely filled to the brim with individuals who are entirely comfortable allowing an entire generation of young Americans to be completely crushed beneath the artificial, suffocating weight of predatory educational lending." She continued her lecture, her voice echoing with practiced passion. There are countless folks in this country right now, and a large number of them are watching this live broadcast, who operate under the dangerous delusion that saddling teenagers with insurmountable lifelong debt is somehow a necessary component of a functional capitalist economy. It absolutely is not, she stated dismissively. It merely makes the massive financial institutions wealthier, and protecting bank profits is absolutely not the same thing as protecting the American dream. I am absolutely not going to sit here and pretend that individuals who have built their entire foundational understanding of higher education on outdated models from 40 years ago, back when tuition could be paid with a summer job, are somehow qualified to lecture me on modern financial survival. A thin, confident, and slightly condescending smile formed on her face. I represent the voices of those who have been systematically left behind. The folks sitting here frowning across from me represent a relic of a past system that is already long over. Therefore, let us not confuse a standard administrative hearing with an endorsement of the corrupt status quo. She leaned back deeply into her leather chair, appearing immensely satisfied with herself. In one fell swoop, she had essentially painted any opposition to her grand forgiveness plan as a direct endorsement of corporate greed, genuinely believing that her rhetorical blow had landed perfectly and effectively, silenced any conservative rebuttal before it even began. John Kennedy displayed absolutely zero visible reaction to the sweeping, insulting statement, keeping true to his core nature. He never reacted impulsively. He remained perfectly seated with his hands calmly folded together, his reading glasses pushed low down on the bridge of his nose, exhibiting the immense, quiet patience of an outdoorsman who has spent countless actual hours sitting in a small boat, simply waiting on a fish that might not even be hungry. He generously allowed her to finish her entire monologue. He allowed the roaring applause she clearly expected from her staffers to settle down completely into a heavy, awkward silence in the room. He intentionally let that deafening silence stretch out for a full half-second past the point of being comfortable, and then he mercilessly stretched it for another half-second past that, dragging it out until the reporters in the room genuinely started to wonder if he had heard her statement at all. Finally, he leaned forward into his own microphone. The very first thing he decided to do was to express his gratitude. "Congresswoman, thank you kindly for that statement." That was real educational, he noted, letting the final word hang in the air, turning it over in the profound silence. I learned a whole lot just now about your deep, burning passion for ensuring that the federal government steps in to help out those who are struggling the absolute most. Now, I am going to be completely honest with you, Kennedy stated plainly. You are definitely right about one specific thing. I am not a brilliant or smart man when it comes to your specific brand of modern economic theory. He leaned in further, his southern drawl thickening slightly. I am just a simple country lawyer hailing from Zachary, Louisiana, a place where the humidity is thick, and folks down there still have to wake up long before the sun rises to go to jobs that absolutely ruin their backs, just to pay for goods with money they actually earned through physical labor. Therefore, he continued, I am going to need you to actively teach me, and I am going to time myself doing it, because I know that your time in Washington is incredibly valuable. Just give me 2 minutes. 2 minutes of incredibly small basic questions, and you can just help a slow fellow like myself keep up with you. Can you manage to do that for me? She smiled a tight, patronizing smile, clearly assuming she had the upper hand. I will try my best to keep it simple for you, Senator, she replied. I would be deeply grateful, ma'am. Truly, he said, turning his gaze to the large clock mounted on the wall. Here begins the first minute. When you publicly say we need to forgive these massive loans Kennedy initiated, you essentially mean that the federal government ought to utilize taxpayer funds to completely eliminate the debts of these individuals so they can have a fair shot at building their lives without the burden of the banks. That is the fundamental heart of it, correct? Yes, that is the heart of it, she answered, sounding quite proud. And of course she was proud. She had constructed a massive portion of her political identity upon that very foundation. And when you advocate for this policy, you mean that you stand firmly against a corrupt system that takes money from the struggling everyday folks and hands it over to the wealthy elites who are already living large and lavishly? That is exactly what it means, she confirmed definitively. Good, excellent. You see, I am managing to keep up, he nodded, appearing highly pleased with his own comprehension, acting exactly like a young student receiving a gold star for effort. So, logically, a public policy that truly and deeply reflected that philosophy all the way down to its core would absolutely never take tax dollars collected from working-class laborers to pay off the personal bills of affluent professionals, would it? For the absolute first time during the exchange, something visibly shifted behind her eyes. It was a tiny flicker of realization, a sudden understanding of the terrain she was being led onto. However, the bright television cameras were locked directly onto her face. The core principle was undeniably hers, and she fundamentally could not contradict her very own gospel while broadcasting on live national television. Public policy should certainly prioritize the working class. Yes, she conceded cautiously, choosing her words with sudden care. That is a mighty fine answer. And I just have one more question, and then I will completely quit pestering you, he noted, holding up a single index finger as though the inquiry had just organically popped into his mind. If a specific policy preached equity but actively created the exact opposite, if it took tax revenue from plumbers, carpenters, and grocery store clerks and used it to completely wipe out the six-figure debts of corporate lawyers, business consultants, and private practice doctors, what exactly would you call that specific policy, Congresswoman? He pushed a bit further. You are the individual with the incredibly fine education here. Please give me the proper vocabulary word for a system that taxes the blue-collar worker to actively subsidize the white-collar professional. She absolutely should have seen the snare right then and there. Perhaps some deeply buried part of her political intuition actually did sense it. But the requested definition was simply too clear. The entire room was watching her closely, and she had spent her entire political career acting as the ultimate authority who named and defined economic injustice. I would call that a regressive transfer of wealth, she stated, maintaining her composure and using the precise academic terminology she favored. A regressive transfer of wealth, Kennedy repeated the phrase incredibly slowly, turning it over on his tongue exactly as if he were learning a brand new concept for the very first time. That is the exact phrase. Thank you kindly. I will make sure to hang on to that one. He then folded his hands just a fraction tighter together on the desk, and the metaphorical trap officially closed its first inch without making a single sound. I just wanted to make sure we got that clearly on the official record before we started, so absolutely nobody can claim later on that you got tricked into saying it. You specifically defined the concept. You are extremely proud of your stance, and you firmly oppose regressive policies. I do, she affirmed, her chin lifting slightly. Please hold that thought, Congresswoman. Hold on to it real tight. We have got about 1 minute remaining on the clock, Kennedy advised. Immediately following that statement, he reached his hand deep into his suit coat pocket and slowly withdrew a thin envelope made of brown craft paper. Its corners had gone soft and frayed from repeated handling. This was no massive banker's box of evidence, nor was it a thick, intimidating legal folder. It was just a simple, worn envelope that a man could easily fit into a single pocket. He carefully opened the flap, and the very first item he extracted was the data sheet. He gently set it down on the table and smoothed the paper once with 2 fingers. This document is a real, authentic report that the Federal Reserve currently publishes, he stated clearly. Now, according to these exact numbers, over half of all the student loan debt in this entire country is currently held by individuals who went on to earn master's degrees, medical degrees, and law degrees. That is a very real, substantial statistic representing a whole lot of future wealth and earning power. He set the paper down very gently. Now, hold on. Please do not answer me just yet. I have still got more of my minute left on the clock. He proceeded to draw out the very next sheet of printed paper from the envelope. A couple of months back, you stood up at a highly publicized rally up in New York, very energetic, and you passionately told the massive crowd that canceling student debt was the ultimate victory for the working class. He laid the printed page flat on the desk, and yet the data sitting right here tells me that the primary beneficiaries of this specific cancellation are folks making well over $100,000 a year. The people working in the absolute highest paying sectors of our economy. We must look at the systemic racial wealth gap and the individuals who are forced into these loans just to survive. She instantly defended, her voice rising in pitch. This is not just about wealthy graduates. You are cherry-picking data. I know that, ma'am. I know there are exceptional cases. That is kind of the overarching theme here, but we will certainly get to the reality of the vast majority, he replied smoothly, completely unbothered by her interruption. He pulled his reading glasses down yet another notch on his nose. Here is the specific part that a slow fellow like myself just cannot seem to get past. Your very own political allies, the independent budget analysts, signed off on this. They closely looked at the actual distribution of this forgiveness, and they formally found that a massive portion of the financial benefit flows directly upwards to the top earning percentiles of society. He stared at her intensely. Do you know exactly where the money to pay for that forgiveness ultimately comes from? She remained silent, her jaw tight, but she clearly knew the answer, and everyone in the room could see that she knew it. It comes from the General Tax Fund, Kennedy read aloud, which means it comes from everybody. He looked up slowly over the metal rims of his glasses. It is that specific detail that has truly kept me up at night, Congresswoman. A young professional goes to a prestigious university, earns a law degree, lands a lucrative corporate job, and the financial penalty of their education is entirely wiped away by the government. I just keep thinking to myself that somewhere out there is a working class mechanic who never set foot on a college campus, who actually has to pay higher taxes just to fund that lawyer's debt relief. The room collectively made a sound, a low murmur, that served as the very first visible crack in the tension. You absolutely are not fighting for the working class with this policy, ma'am, Kennedy stated, his folksy demeanor thinning out for just a fraction of a second. You are merely taking their hard-earned tax dollars, and you are willingly letting the blue-collar folks pay for the white-collar folks' education. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had found herself in this precise type of defensive situation before. She knew this rhetorical terrain vastly better than Kennedy assumed she did. Consequently, she executed the exact maneuver she always utilized whenever the factual ground began to crumble beneath her feet. She attempted to change entirely what the fundamental fight was actually about. She aggressively pulled her microphone closer to her face, and her vocal tone dropped into a low, fast, and furious cadence. "I know exactly what this spectacle is," she declared passionately. "This has never, not once, actually been about protecting blue-collar workers. This is fundamentally about a concerted effort to prevent an entire generation from achieving financial independence. It is a system that privileged men exactly like you have spent your entire political careers actively trying to uphold to keep marginalized people trapped in a perpetual cycle of debt." She continued her intense barrage, leaning over the table. "You meticulously dissect the statistics in a highly scrutinized way to obscure the very real human suffering caused by predatory lending. You choose to call it fiscal responsibility. I call it exactly what it is. It is an entrenched establishment desperately trying to punish everyday Americans for daring to seek a higher education. And every single person watching this broadcast who has ever been made to feel crushed by a monthly loan payment knows exactly what they are looking at right now. And for a fleeting moment, you must give her credit for this, because the emotional shift was palpable and real. The entire room moved alongside her narrative. It was a clean, well-practiced rhetorical punch. It was a speech that had successfully landed in 100 different rooms prior to this one, and the ingrained muscle memory was undeniably still present in her delivery. A nearby reporter's pen immediately started moving frantically across their notepad. A young political staffer positioned directly behind her nodded their head hard twice in rapid succession. The momentum of the room was entirely hers, fully within her grasp, and it held firm. You could physically feel the old familiar reflex move through the audience like an electrical current. This momentum held for exactly about 30 seconds. It might have held on for even longer than that, but Kennedy completely refused to flinch. He deliberately did not do the specific thing that her speech was entirely engineered to force him to do. He did not become defensive. He did not offer any form of apology, and he most certainly did not raise his voice in anger. He simply sat there and waited patiently until she was completely finished speaking. Then he executed a maneuver that was vastly quieter than anyone in the room had braced themselves for. He looked up from his papers, but he did not look at her. Instead, he gazed entirely past her, directing his undivided attention toward the fourth row of the audience. "Ma'am," he said calmly, his voice cutting through the lingering tension, "I am absolutely not going to sit here and talk over you regarding who suffers the most in our economy. I would not presume to do so. However, there is a certain gentleman sitting back there in the audience who specifically asked to say something before we started today, and the committee chairman said he could. And I firmly think he ought to get his turn to speak, primarily on account of the fact that he is the exact working class person you keep repeatedly claiming you speak for." Every single head in the cramped room immediately swiveled around to look. There he was, an entirely ordinary, unassuming man wearing an old, faded canvas jacket. He had rough, weather-beaten skin and was nervously holding a worn baseball cap in both of his hands, gripping it exactly like it was an incredibly fragile object. He stood up incredibly slowly, the exact way a man stands up when his aging back has strong, painful opinions about the movement. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely devoid of anger. That lack of fury was exactly the thing that made the entirety of the chaotic room go dead still. It was not angry in the slightest. It was simply incredibly tired and a little bit uncomfortable to be standing up in front of all those cameras. "I am not anybody important," he stated softly. "I am just Mike, a plumber from Louisiana. When I was 18 years old, I took out a commercial loan at 10% interest to buy a used service truck and the heavy tools I needed to start working. I worked 12-hour days, sometimes in the freezing rain, and I voluntarily paid back every single dollar of that loan out of my own pocket because that was my responsibility." He briefly looked down at his calloused hands, then looked back up at the Congresswoman. "I never got the chance to go to a fancy university. I just went straight to work. I just have this one single question, and then I promise I will sit back down," he continued softly. "Why exactly should my federal tax dollars, the money taken out of my paycheck every week after crawling under houses, fixing busted pipes, be given to the government so they can pay off the debts of a young person who got a master's degree and now sits in an air-conditioned office in Manhattan making twice as much money as I do. That is all. I just want to know the truth of why that is fair. Having spoken his piece, he quietly sat back down, rested his cap patiently on his lap, and simply waited for an answer. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez opened her mouth to respond and then immediately closed it. She realized instantaneously that there was absolutely no version of the passionate speech she had just delivered, the one extensively detailing oppressive establishments and generational debt cycles that would work even slightly effectively on an aging working-class plumber in a faded jacket who had literally paid his own way through backbreaking manual labor. This man had only asked a basic, fundamental question about where his tax contributions were going. Right there in that moment, an authentic working-class laborer, the exact demographic she constantly claimed to passionately fight for, was standing up in a dead quiet room and asking a simple, direct question that the Congresswoman found herself completely unable to answer. Kennedy permitted the heavy silence to breathe fully within the room. He was exceptionally skilled at utilizing silence. It was arguably the tactic he was best at deploying. He deliberately took a slow, methodical sip of his own glass of water and set the glass back down on the table with a small, deliberate, audible click. That tiny click served as the absolute only sound heard in that entire room for a painfully long 3 seconds. I would truly hate to leave that hard-working gentleman's valid question hanging completely unanswered, he drawled. So let us just go ahead and look directly at the reality of this wealth transfer, since he specifically asked about fairness. He reached back into the brown craft envelope once again, pulling out more thin printed sheets of paper. He proceeded to lay them out across the desk one at a time, reading the political donation numbers off in a flat, monotonous tone, exactly the way a person would read off a mundane grocery list. He knew the numbers absolutely did not need any dramatic help or embellishment from his delivery. In just one single election cycle, Kennedy outlined, according to official campaign finance filings, these are not my personal numbers, ma'am. These are the exact public records. Your political movement received massive amounts of financial support explicitly from young white-collar tech workers and corporate professionals residing in our wealthiest urban centers. He casually moved on to the very next page of documentation. And here is a specific demographic breakdown of who exactly holds the federal student loans you want to cancel. I want to make sure I get this exactly right. The vast majority of the total dollar amount is held by the top 40% of income earners in this country. He looked up from the paper to meet her eyes. You went out and heroically promised to fight the system. And to do all this fighting, you are proposing a policy that effectively takes tax revenue from the plumbers, the truck drivers, and the factory workers and hands it directly as a massive financial gift to the very same demographic of highly educated professionals who enthusiastically fund your campaigns. Senator, you are deliberately ignoring the millions of lower-income borrowers who are drowning, she attempted to interrupt hastily. They represent a fraction of the total dollar amount, Congresswoman. The official data clearly states the bulk of the money goes to the top, he corrected, laying the page down softly on the growing pile. And here is the final thought I keep coming back to, specifically on account of that hard-working gentleman from Louisiana sitting right there, he continued. You constantly talk about fighting for equity. And while you are physically doing that, you put out promotional material talking about how it absolutely breaks your heart to see the working class struggle to afford groceries and gasoline. He pulled out the absolute last sheet of paper. It was a mock federal tax invoice, explicitly printed to illustrate the added national debt burden per taxpayer under her plan. He set the final paper down. He then meticulously aligned the invoice directly against the tall stack of demographic data, perfectly aligning them edge to edge. So, let me just state it as plainly as I can. Exactly like you asked me to at the very start of this hearing, Kennedy said, you sold a political narrative about saving the poor and punishing the rich. And then you turned around and engineered a massive government bailout that forces a man who paid off his own work truck to subsidize the lifestyle of a corporate consultant making 6 figures. He spread his hands out wide in a gesture of utter helplessness, perfectly playing the role of a simple man completely bested by basic arithmetic. I am slow, Congresswoman. I explicitly told you I was slow. But I am absolutely not so slow that I cannot clearly see that the regressive transfer of wealth in this specific story is being championed by the exact person who claims to hate it the most. You want to entirely reduce my entire life's work to a single statistic? She challenged him fiercely, her panic cooling into a steady anger. Fine, let me explicitly tell you what I actually am. I have waited tables. I have tended bar. I have stood on painfully swollen feet at the agonizing end of a grueling double shift and desperately counted my tips just to see if I could cover the cost of the train ride home. I intimately know the exact heavy weight of financial struggle in a way that you, Senator, will never, ever have to learn. I am absolutely not afraid of this conversation. And her rebuttal was undeniably good. For a brief moment, a substantial portion of the emotional heat actually came back into the room firmly on her side. The overwhelming current of the room visibly wavered. Kennedy patiently let her finish every word. He let the entire emotional weight of her statement land squarely in the room, and then he entirely took the gloves off. Congresswoman, he said incredibly quietly, speaking so softly that the entire room physically leaned in just to catch his words. I completely believe every single word of that. I believe you waited tables. I believe you counted tips. I believe you know the struggle. And that is exactly why all of this is vastly worse. The room went dead still in a completely different, much more profound way now. Because you do know the real weight of a dollar, he stated, pointing at the tax invoice, you inherently know it vastly better than I ever will. You know exactly what a tax hike means to a struggling plumber, because you used to desperately count those dollars yourself. And yet, you intentionally decided to take his money anyway. He held his intense gaze right there. A privileged man like myself, raised soft and comfortable, I might accidentally propose a regressive policy purely out of sheer ignorance. You just desperately hope that he forgets who is actually paying the bill. Absolutely nobody in the room laughed. That singular phrase bypassed laughter entirely. It went down into a much deeper, darker place. Before she could launch another massive rhetorical swing, Kennedy executed the absolute last move. He physically picked up the mock tax invoice. He then slid the piece of paper completely across the smooth wooden table toward her side, stopping it only when it sat positioned just inches in front of her paralyzed hands. Here, he commanded. If you genuinely believe this policy is a victory for the working class, you take this bill. He sat all the way back in his chair. Go on and pick it right up, Congresswoman. Please look that gentleman in the eye. The very one who fixed pipes in the freezing rain to pay his own debts. If you genuinely still believe in this policy, you pick that tax bill up right now, hand it to him, and you tell him directly to his face that it is his moral duty to pay for a corporate lawyer's education. The entire packed room held its collective breath as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez instinctively reached forward. Every single camera lens tracked her manicured fingers closing the short physical distance, stopping a mere inch above the stark white paper. Suddenly, her hand halted. It hung completely motionless in the stark fluorescent lighting before frantically pulling back, behaving exactly as if she had touched a scorching hot stove. Folding both of her hands tightly in her lap, she outright refused to touch the document. She refused to speak the justification aloud. She remained entirely silent. The final, fatal blow arrived incredibly quietly. You gave me the vocabulary phrase yourself, Senator Kennedy noted softly, wading through 2 full agonizing seconds of dead silence. You are not fighting for the working class, ma'am. You are just forcing them to pay the bills of your wealthiest supporters. He paused again. And then you call it social justice. When the chairman awkwardly asked if she wished to respond, she definitively did not. That single visual, a politician's hand cowardly pulling away from the real-world cost of her own policy on live television, became the defining image of a massive political narrative permanently breaking. Before the hearing had even concluded, a perfectly cut 40-second clip was circulating online. By mid-afternoon, you literally could not scroll any digital screen in America for 10 seconds without the brutal footage reappearing. What should have concerned her most was that the public was no longer debating loan interest rates or college tuition costs. They were entirely captivated by watching a prominent official fail to hand a bill to a working-class plumber on an endless loop. Evening news broadcasts led with the still frame of her frozen hand. One network simply displayed Kennedy's parting quote in white letters against a black background. Absolutely no punditry was remotely needed. In the grand marble hallway, an anonymous political ally admitted the harsh truth. Everybody saw this massive policy contradiction coming, he whispered nervously. We built a movement on championing the poor, then proposed a massive bailout that overwhelmingly benefits the upper middle class. We covered for her, but you fundamentally cannot cover for a politician refusing to look a blue-collar worker in the eye. No public relations statement can unfreeze that hovering hand. Meanwhile, the humble Louisiana plumber walked out of the claustrophobic, heavily ornamented building, stepping away from the suffocating, artificially cooled air of the congressional hearing room and out into the thick, muggy reality of the Washington, D.C. afternoon. He hailed a standard yellow cab to the airport, his movements steady, deliberate, and entirely devoid of the panicked energy that had consumed the Capitol. He completely ignored the frantic swarm of reporters who scrambled after him like starved wolves, their microphones thrust aggressively toward his face, their overlapping questions bleeding into a wall of meaningless, chaotic noise. He did not need to give a statement or seek 15 minutes of internet fame. The deeply pathetic image of that trembling, perfectly manicured hand stopping, a mere inch above the mock tax invoice, was all the definitive, undeniable answer he would ever need. Gazing out the smudged window of the taxi at the sprawling capital city, with its pristine white marble monuments and towering pillars of institutional power, he felt a profound disconnect. These grand structures were ostensibly built to serve men like him, yet they housed individuals who fundamentally misunderstood his existence. He realized, with a quiet, settling weight in his chest, that he had finally managed to ask the crucial, undeniable question on behalf of every exhausted, struggling taxpayer in the nation, the silent, working majority who would never get the chance to sit face to face with the powerful elites who dictated their financial futures. The long flight back to the Deep South was a blur of quiet, sobering reflection. Arriving at his modest single-story home late that night, he was greeted by the familiar, comforting chorus of cicadas and the thick, suffocating humidity of the Louisiana summer. The front porch light was still burning exactly as he had left it hours earlier, serving as a small, solitary beacon of his own self-reliance. He performed a quiet and intensely private routine, completely unwitnessed by the flashing cameras or the posturing politicians. He unzipped and hung his faded, heavy canvas work jacket on the rusted brass hook by the front door, the stiff fabric bearing the permanent dark stains of years of dried sweat and industrial grease. Stepping to the sink with solemn, almost religious precision, he washed the stubborn grime from his hands. He used the harsh pumice grit soap required of his grueling trade, scrubbing until his callous skin was raw, handling himself exactly like a man who intimately knew the true, unvarnished, back-breaking value of a single, hard-earned dollar. Looking at his deeply lined face in the bathroom mirror, he did not feel victorious. There was no triumphant cheering in his quiet house. He simply felt deeply, fundamentally validated. A massive foundational piece of his belief in the American political system remained forever altered, replaced by a cold, hard understanding that the loudest, most passionate voices claiming to help him were more often than not the very same ones actively reaching directly into his pockets. Meanwhile, back in the absolute epicenter of the political fallout, Senator John Kennedy did exactly what he always did, essentially nothing out of the ordinary at all. While the hearing room erupted into chaotic whispers and frantic aides rushed to perform damage control, the senator remained an island of complete tranquility. He methodically gathered his printed demographic data sheets, aligning the sharp corners with agonizing slowness. He folded them precisely down the middle, sliding them back into that unassuming, worn craft paper envelope that had served as the quiet graveyard for so many arrogant political arguments. He tucked the envelope securely into the interior pocket of his tailored suit, resting it right over his heart like a protective shield of undeniable mathematics. Turning away from the massive mahogany committee table, he walked out of the crowded hearing room without uttering another syllable to anyone. He did not smile. He did not gloat over his massive rhetorical victory. He simply strode forward. He moved effortlessly past the blinding flashes of digital cameras, past the frantic, shouting reporters begging for sound bites, and past the painfully empty leather chair of a politician who had enthusiastically sold a beautiful, shimmering vision of equity to the country, only to finally run out of rhetorical ways to hide the real, unforgiving mathematics of her own policies. He had warned her initially, right at the very beginning of the agonizing exchange, that he was merely a slow fellow, a simple country lawyer, desperately struggling to keep up with the advanced, complex economic concepts of the coastal elite. It was a perfectly executed camouflage. Yet the devastating, undeniable truth that she realized far too late, only after the metaphorical trap had completely snapped shut around her narrative, was that Kennedy could always make the math work out. He did not need to raise his voice, bang his fists on the table, or interrupt his colleagues. He merely preferred, with the endless patience of a seasoned hunter, to let his opponents finish their arrogant bragging first. He allowed them to meticulously build their towering castles of moral superiority, only to quietly remove the mathematical foundation from beneath them. Carefulness, it turned out, was genuinely the absolute smartest choice a person could make in a room full of reckless ambition. Please take a moment to share this exact video with someone who works incredibly hard for every single dollar they earn. Send it to the mechanic, the carpenter, the waitress, and the plumber. Your perspective, your struggle, and your quiet dignity truly matter in a system that constantly tries to overlook you in favor of the elite. The absolute truth of the matter never required a massive public relations team, a multi-million-dollar campaign fund, or an Ivy League degree to be understood. The truth only ever needed basic math, an unwavering connection to reality, and the steady, unflinching nerve to force the powerful to look at the exact bill they are handing to the working class.